Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'as fait manquer, Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'as pas fait, Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime.
Hello and welcome to Brussels, my love, our weekly talk show from the heart of Europe. Here we discuss what moves Europe for better or for worse. I'm Stefan Grobe. Thanks for tuning in. Coming up this week, in the Middle East, we've come to a turning point. Many of Israel's remaining allies have broken publicly with Benjamin Netanyahu's government for its relentless pummeling of Gaza and freezing of desperately needed humanitarian aid. In a highly unusual move, Canada, France and the UK threatened Israel with consequences. And even Donald Trump seems to run out of patience. Will Netanyahu listen? And the European Union wants to make available 150 billion euros to boost domestic defense production. The plan, known as SAFE, was proposed by the Commission and approved by the Council, using a legal shortcut that bypasses the European Parliament. This has sparked a wave of criticism not only among members. Is this a power grab of the executive, or is the defense initiative too important to be left with lawmakers? Questions I'd like to ask our guests today, and here they are. James Moran, Associate Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for European Policy Studies, Kathleen Van Bremt, Member of the European Parliament from the Social Democrats, and Jacob Reynolds, Head of Policy at Hungarian think tank MCC Brussels. Welcome again, and thanks for joining us. But before we start, let's hear about the situation in Gaza from our correspondent, Sasha Vakulina.
International pressure has been mounting on Israel over the past several days over its strategy in Gaza. The European Union said it will review its wide-ranging trade and cooperation pact with Israel over what Brussels sees as a catastrophic situation in Gaza. The leaders of France, the UK and Canada condemned what they call Israel's egregious military actions in Gaza and threatened to take concrete steps if the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu does not change his course, particularly when it comes to the humanitarian aid. Now, it doesn't look like he is willing to change anything. Israel launched a new military offensive into the enclave amid the reports that Israel's military plans to control 75% of Gaza within the next 2 months.
It doesn't look like he's willing to change anything. Is that your impression as well, James? I want to start with you.
It's going to be very difficult to have any influence over Benjamin Netanyahu and his government, which is, I think, by almost all counts, an extremist government dedicated to the military campaign in Gaza. But that's not to say that it's not worth reviewing the relationship. And I think the measures that were taken recently to do that are timely. Well, they could have been made earlier. Of course, it was on the table before. Spain, Ireland, other countries had gone for that. And I think it sends a message, above all, to the Israeli government that some of their closest allies are worried, very worried and very concerned about what's going on there. I think it was very significant that yesterday the Chancellor of Germany, Mr. Merz, came out and said what he said. Germany is normally, of course, a staunch supporter of Israel, but even the German government seemed to have had enough. The question then, of course, is will these measures have any effect?
Yeah, right. The biggest supporter remains the United States, Kathleen, but even Trump, as we heard, is unhappy with the things going on in Gaza. Is Netanyahu trying to outsmart Trump on this, or does Trump have the leverage necessary to make Netanyahu change course?
Well, Netanyahu will only listen to Trump. That's my analysis. Maybe he will listen to a united European Union because we have, of course, the power of the economics. We have the power of trade. But I agree with what you said, but it's all very little, very late and too weak. I'm very happy with what Merz said, and I do take into account for a German, it is a big step to take. But as long as there's no united Europe on Gaza, as we've been on Ukraine, if we would have been as forceful as we have been on Ukraine, this wouldn't have happened as it happened today. Going back to the States, yes, I think the leverage is within Trump, but I don't think he will use it. As we've seen Trump the last couple of months, well, since he's in office, he changes his mind every now and then, every week, every 2 hours, I don't know. And of course, even Trump must have some sort of conscience or heart, I don't know, because what you see is becoming so unbearable that he reacts. But what he should do is cut off the funds and impose, as Europe should do, an embargo on arms, for instance.
Jacob, what's your take? There are many observers who say, well, Netanyahu does what he does because of domestic reasons. His coalition partners, the right religious partners, want him to do that, and if he doesn't, they will dump him, and then he would face all kinds of trouble. Is that one of the reasons why he is so stubborn?
Well, we can get on to discussing internal situation in Israel, but at least in Europe, and especially in the European Union, I'd say that they need to take a little bit of a reality check. No country has ever kind of changed course on matters of what it thinks of existential importance as a result of a slightly different trade relationship with the European Union. And of course, the European Union and EU politicians love to, and are experts at producing words, resolutions, conducting reviews, other bureaucratic exercises. But as we know from almost every geopolitical situation of the last several years, when it comes to actually influencing events around the world, the EU's barely at the table when it comes to those kinds of conversations. And of course, we'll get into this later in the program, but we have to ask serious questions about why that is. But we also have to ask serious questions about why is it that when the EU essentially knows that it's impotent on the world stage, why does it love producing kind of words and statements and stuff? And I'd argue that that's because for lots of politicians, the Israel and Gaza issue is much more an opportunity for virtue signaling, for making a moral statement, for sounding good, rather than actually
let's come to that one step that the EU took this week. The US finally decided to review the EU-Israel Association Agreement, which covers topics ranging from the framework for political dialogue to agriculture and the free exchange of goods. We wanted to know about the politics of this move by Brussels and spoke to David Rigoulet-Rose from the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs. Here's what he said. Take a listen.
C'est évidemment un signalement politique très fort qui a été mal apprécié, évidemment, en Israël.
It's clearly a very strong political signal which was understandably poorly received in Israel, but that doesn't mean the agreement will become void. It's simply a step that reflects a clear shift in the rhetoric regarding the consequences of the war in Gaza.
Des conséquences de la guerre à Gaza. De toute façon, il n'y a pas une unanimité de posture.
In any case, there is no unified stance amongst the 27 EU member states on this issue. In fact, there are often very different views.
Il y a parfois des appréciations très différentes.
Yeah, let's talk about these different views. So we know that on the one hand, we have countries like Ireland, Spain, Sweden, siding with the Palestinians, and then Israel, Germany, Austria, and some others staunchly pro-Israel. We've heard about Friedrich Merz. Is that his statement, the questioning basically Israel's strategy in Gaza, is that a sign that Germany doesn't want to be isolated in the European Union?
I think it's unprecedented. We haven't heard anything like that from Germany under any chancellor, whether it left, right, centre, for decades, in fact, at all. Since, indeed, the war. So this is a very important statement made by Mr. Merz. Of course, it's a statement. But look, I just want to go back to something Jacob said. Internally in Israel, there's a very large constituency, not a majority, but a very large constituency which is extremely worried about this war, whether it be because of the lack of success in releasing the hostages, whether it be opposition to Netanyahu and his position on social matters and so forth, and the judiciary in the country. But this is a message above all to them, to the inside Israel, because this is a relationship of many layers. It's not just about government to government. And so the opposition forces in Israel, I think, will have been strengthened by this, and that's important, because at the end of the day, whatever you say about Europe, whatever you say about America, the only real way of changing this is to change the government or the course of the government in Israel itself. It is the Israeli population at the end of the day which is probably the most important.
Yeah. Jacob?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's quite a revealing statement that I think demonstrates a lot about how European Union or European figures like to treat events in other countries, i.e. saying that the attitudes of a government are not what matters. What matters is us trying to exert kind of power internally, not going in the steps of preferring to change regimes in other countries rather than deal with them as they are. This is quite a revealing statement. I'd say
that power for the sake of power, right? It's the situation on the ground that is.
Well, I think, and coming back to the Merz, I think what we're seeing is that. So after the awful barbaric pogrom of October 7th, there was a degree of moral clarity that suggested that Israel had a legitimate right to defend itself, that no country should be expected to tolerate what Israel is expected to tolerate. And sadly, it seems that that kind of clarity, of that moral clarity, is slowly dissipating, and lots of politicians under various kinds of pressure, and which we can get into, but are starting to feel that they can take a very different line on Israel. And that's I think, worrying, because it suggests that the thing that motivated lots of responses among people and politicians from the beginning is starting to weigh off, and that we're losing sight of what's really at stake in the conflict.
50,000 deaths later. Now, this is utterly disproportionate. And I think that has been the moving force that is behind this. Public opinion right across Europe, in most European countries, and non-EU countries too, has been pretty clear on this for the last few months. And Israel has only made it worse by restarting the military campaign and breaking the ceasefire a month or two ago.
Kathleen, on this.
Well, absolutely. I completely agree. I think Belgium, for instance, I'm from Belgium, there's always been a huge support in public opinion. That is different in other countries like Germany, although you see in recent polls that also in Germany the public opinion is switching. And of course, politicians need to follow suit. That is important. And as you said, I agree. It's at the end, it's the Israeli people that will change the government, who will need to change the government, and then there is some prospect for some peace and maybe even for a two-state solution and things like that. But in the meantime, the only thing we need to do from a European perspective is to put massive pressure on Netanyahu's government. And as I said before, the economic leverage, trade is very important, and an embargo on weapons. I think these two are the ones that we need to do now. You said that we are going to revise the association agreement. We're not yet there. That is the disaster we're in. We're only at the point that we are going to investigate. So it goes really much too slow.
Well, I didn't say that they would do it. They started the process of the reviewing. But on that matter, our analyst said that this process wouldn't make the agreement, void, and that the step merely signals a clear shift in the rhetoric. Is that true? And why then was Israel so worked up about it?
Well, of course, Israel feels greatly the pressure, the loss of potential allies. That would be true of any country in its situation. But it's still the case that it's incredibly unlikely that something substantial is going to result from the reviewing of the association agreement for reasons that the report mentioned. And so, again, it comes back to this is a kind of preferred tactic of the European Union, of European institutions, that we'd like to do resolutions, like to issue statements, like to put things under review, like to engage in bureaucratic process, like to take votes in Parliament, but non-binding votes in Parliament, right? But very little actually changes because Europe doesn't really have a seat.
We have a member of Parliament right here.
This is too easy. Everything is much more complex than that. I mentioned before, we can be really dedicated and really efficient when we are united. We did that with Ukraine. We haven't solved it yet. But Ukraine is still there and not overrun by the Russians because we give them a lot of money in support, we give them a lot of arms, and we give them a lot of moral support as well. And if necessary, more will come. We've been very crystal clear on that. So the moment we are united, we can act decisively. And then sometimes we need to put Orban to the toilets to make sure that we remain united, but we still can do that. For obvious historic reasons, we cannot do that yet when it comes to Israel. But the shift of Merz is the first time that you see that there is something possible. Maybe sanctions, maybe trade issues, but things are becoming too late, too little. I agree from my perspective. Right. But let's keep the heat on.
Can I add on member states? It's interesting, I think, that the proposal put to the Foreign Affairs Council to review the association agreement was made by the Netherlands.
Right.
The Netherlands is also on the record since a long time of being a staunch supporter of Israel. Israel is losing its best friends in Europe, one by one. This is going to continue so long as the situation on the ground in Gaza remains as tragic and as catastrophic as it is. We saw last night the shambles of this so-called humanitarian distribution hub in Rafah. And there is no answer to this other than letting the aid in, getting a ceasefire and moving on from that. But at the moment, the Israeli government seems set on this course.
All right, there are two sides in this conflict here. There's Israel, but there's also Hamas. Does Europe have any leverage on Hamas?
Well, it might have finally stopped sending money to Hamas operatives under the guise of humanitarian aid, although there's probably the case that still goes on. But ultimately, the question is not should the EU or European countries put pressure on Hamas, because it's Israel's job to destroy Hamas, and that's the legitimate aim and the legitimate ambition of Israel in Gaza. And no country would be expected to live with a radical Islamist terrorist organization that is intent on destroying it.
Well, even
only Israel
Trump
expected
speaks
to
with the Hamas, right, through his
directly.
invoice.
Yeah, well,
do you have
the Americans.
Do you have any evidence of humanitarian aid being sent to Hamas operatives?
We know from lots of reports that the UN missions.
Can you cite them?
But yeah, of course. But we can dig them out if you like. But there's plenty of evidence of this, right? Everybody knows that. Everyone knows that even humanitarian so-called workers participated in October 7th, right? So these are documented.
Where's the evidence?
No,
they did an investigation, and there was no evidence to support that. So it's a little bit supporting fake news here, and I'm quite astonished. Do you actually think we should not send humanitarian aid to Gaza?
I think that Hamas has put a very, very
no. Do you think that we should not do humanitarian aid to Gaza? That we should not do that?
Yes, you can make it sound
let
simple
people starve.
But
it is simple. People are starving.
Yeah, they're starving because Hamas controls the aid.
No, they're starving because they're living in a
denies the civilian and population of
Gaza.
They
are starving.
These are all. This is the tactic that Hamas
is Hamas still operating as it used to be in Gaza?
No.
Thankfully, not to the degree that it was.
It has been in military terms, it's been defenestrated. There's no question about that. It's almost lost, not entirely, but almost lost its capacity. Governance terms, there's a lot of trouble. You saw the demonstrations inside Gaza by the population there against Hamas in the last week or two, and that's been
European
rising.
Politicians were not very quick to support.
But I just want to come back to this. I mean, when it comes to the problem of humanitarian aid, this is almost entirely the result of the Israeli military campaign, and we should not lose sight of that. Anything other, to me, seems to me to be just propaganda put out by extremist elements in the Israeli government, in particular, not just the Prime Minister, but particularly these far-right ultranationalists, ministers that he has within that government, who have been speaking of all sorts of terrible terms, cleansing Gaza and all the rest of it. I'm referring to the Finance Minister, Smotrich, and to the Security Minister, Ben-Gvir. And they're on the record for months saying these things, and they hold the whip hand over the Netanyahu government, which explains a lot as to why Netanyahu continues with the military campaign.
What is the end game here? Are we losing sight of the two-state solutions that has been on the table for many, many years, but we're not really advancing? Is there, I mean, this war in Gaza will be over one day.
Yeah.
What comes next?
Well, it's clear that there can't be any solution to the problem of Israel and Palestine until Hamas is destroyed and has no military or governmental capacity and doesn't exist as an organization, right? So the first thing that we have to have very simple clarity on is that there can be no solution of any kind whilst Hamas retains control in Gaza or elsewhere, right? So that's I think been the overriding ambition of the Israeli military campaign, which and there's legitimate questions to be asked. Have they pursued it in the right way? Have sometimes lines been crossed? All those are legitimate parts of the discussion. But we have to agree on a very simple fact. You can't have any kind of solution if you have a radical terrorist Islamist organization in control of a substantial territory. That's simple. We can then get on to what comes after.
I partly agree in the sense that there should not be extremists on both sides. Because you remember when there was some chance of two-stage solution with the Oslo Agreement, it was shot to to the eternity, I don't hope so, but by the two extremes, both in Israel and both in Palestine. And only a solution will come by moderate politicians. And I'm quite sure that that is what the Palestinian people want as well. The really frightening thing on what's happening next to the humanitarian catastrophe over there is that famine is used to not just organize a genocide, but also cleanse the whole Gaza Strip. And that needs to be avoided at any case. And the one and only positive thing out of this is, first of all, what's happening in the public opinion also in Germany. And that is going to stay. Huh? This is not just a one-off. This is going to stay, is that the two-state solution is back on track. It was completely lost before these events. It's back on track. I'm not saying I'm hopeful that we will get there soon, but it is the only solution. Can I add just one more argument? I myself am from Antwerp. We have a huge and very important, Muslim and Jewish community, and I am very worried about the polarization over there and the rise of anti-Semitism. The only way of dealing with that at European soil is to make sure that we have peace and a two-state solution. And I know that moderate Jews agree on that.
Yeah.
James,
and the extremists, of course, are on both sides. I do agree
Yes.
in part also with that, but Hamas is not controlling all of Palestine. Not forget the West Bank.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, in the West Bank, we have a real problem too with settler violence. Sanctions have already been put on by the British and by others, and we're thinking about it, I think, we're doing more of it here in Europe too, and rightly so. This is dreadful behavior with impunity from the Israeli government. Under this government, I don't see a way forward to the two-state solution. It will have to change first in Israel as well.
Good. We'll see what happens. And on that point, we can bring this conversation to a close. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, does the end justify the means, even on the edge of legality? All eyes on Europe's defense plans. Don't go away. Welcome back to Brussels, my love. My guests are still Kathleen Van Bremt, Jacob Reynolds, and James Moran. Behind the innocent acronym SAFE, SAFE, lies a risky gamble, a continental ambition, and perhaps the beginning of an assertive military divorce from Washington. SAFE stands for Security Action for Europe, an unprecedented 150 billion euro plan to revolutionize the old continent's defense capabilities. A kind of Marshall Plan for the 21st century, but with support no longer coming from the United States. The EU Commission proposed SAFE through a legislative instrument that allows it to bypass a vote by the Parliament. And this is the problem. Was it a smart move by the Commission, Kathleen?
Let me first say, and there's a democratic reason, but also a reason on content. There's a huge support in the Parliament also for this program, and I agree we should be faster in the European Parliament, but also the Council can take their time. So we should act faster. I absolutely agree on that. And there's also a majority in the Parliament to look at faster procedures. But having said that, you cannot just sideline that one and only institution where there you have the directly elected members by the people, so they're elected by the people. That's a democratic, in a democracy that is key. But the second argument is on the content. This is a first step of many things to come to build, as you mentioned, our own safety, security and peace architecture. For that, you need the European Parliament. You need the support of the democracy.
Move on. Jacob, I saw you nodding at times while Kathleen spoke.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's obvious that this is not a democratic procedure, but then that's hardly news in the history of the European Union, is it? So I think at some level, this suggests we've seen it crisis after crisis. People like to talk about crisis kind of spurring on the European Union to new levels of cohesion, but in reality, crisis is an opportunity for more centralised control by the European Commission over the heads of both elected members in the European Parliament and also sovereign governments.
It was approved by the Council.
Yeah, so we see this process happening kind of, again, whenever there's a crisis, there's a tendency to centralise issues. But on the content, the important thing is that this really has exposed, as you mentioned in your introduction, an enormous problem with the fact that for so long European countries have been very, very happy to very much sit in the back, to take the lead from the United States, to enjoy the fruits of the United States kind of military supremacy, and to not be very serious about our own security. I don't think that a solution to that is going to come through the European Union institutions, because I think that this is a conversation that has to begin and can only really be advanced nationally, because defence is a matter of first and foremost.
Well, the national states can tap into this fund and take out loans.
Yeah, sure.
It is, yes. The member states are indeed the implementers of this programme. But I think this is a learning process. You know, for years, for decades, within the European Union institutions, whether it be the Commission, the Council, or the Parliament, defence has not really featured in discussions. Why? Because the competence has always been, the authority has always been with the member states. It still is to a great extent. But Ukraine has changed all that. And it's true. I think I must also say from the Commission point of view that we need new procedures, faster procedures. You cannot treat defence in the same way as you do economy, social legislation, and the rest.
But we can do that.
Bad example. And I want to bring in a colleague of yours because we wanted to learn more about the thinking inside the European Parliament. And we spoke to the Italian member Mario Furore. He is with the Left Group. And here's what he said.
Noi chiediamo assolutamente due cose. O che venga cambiato il...
We are absolutely demanding two things. Either the legal basis is changed, which is actually the same position taken by President Metsola after the jury committee vote, when she asked the European Commission to change the legal basis, because we clearly oppose the rearmament plan, not only on substance, but also on legal grounds. This legal opinion clearly states that it's wrong. In terms of procedure, the Parliament cannot be bypassed. Article 122 can only be used in very specific cases, like natural disasters or wars, within the EU. This doesn't seem to be the case here, and that's why we firmly opposed it.
Non mi sembra questo il caso, e quindi ci siamo opposti fermamente.
So does he have a fair point here, James? I mean, the President of the European Parliament threatened to sue the European Commission over this. Are we running into a constitutional crisis here?
I don't think it's a constitutional crisis, but I think it's a valid opinion that we've just heard there from the parliamentarian, and indeed from you as well, that we need democratic scrutiny of all European Union activities. We need more of it, not less of it. But this is urgent. This is very urgent. If we have to wait 6 months, 1 year, 2 years for the SAFE programme to have safe passage, as it were, through the Parliament, what happens in the meantime in Ukraine? It makes a substantial contribution, not the only contribution, but a substantial contribution to the defence of Europe, which we desperately need to improve.
Well, Catherine already pointed to the fact that the Parliament is slow, but maybe.
But we can be faster.
It's urgent.
We've, as you mentioned, we have had many crises, and we managed them. Not in a perfect way, we're far from perfect at the European level, but we managed them. Can I give the example of COVID? And that was with the European Parliament, we installed an investment program of 750 billion euros with the support of the democratic scrutiny in the European Parliament in a fast-track procedure. We can do that. So we need to change internally. We need to become more efficient. But again, as I said, this is about the future of our security and peace architecture. This needs to have a full democratic majority behind it.
Yeah. So the question about the constitutional crisis wasn't random. I'm really, Jacob, what's your take? Is if one institution sues the other...
We do that all the time.
On a thing that they basically agree on, right?
Well, I would be far more worried about, if you like, a constitutional crisis by stealth. Because what is happening here is the clear usurpation of powers of the whole area of defence. We're at the start of a process where the area of defence, which is the most fundamental national sovereign institution, it's the kind of sine qua non of national life. We're at the start of a process where the European Union is muscling in on this. And that, for me, represents a far graver threat to the kind of implicit and explicit constitutional order of Europe than some machinations between the institutions.
Can I just add one thing? Because it is an opinion also in the European Parliament, but from the extreme right side. There's such a minority.
I think we'll talk about this. We'll talk about this. So much for our second round. The latest on defense and security in Europe, as always, in our news on our various platforms. For now, many thanks to our guests and viewers. Stay with us. Hello there, you're watching Brussels, my love. I'm Stefan Grobe, and my guests this weekend are Jacob Reynolds from MCC, James Moran from SEPS, and Kathleen Van Brandt, Social Democratic member of the European Parliament. The European Commission is setting the stage for an all-out confrontation with Hungary. Brussels has demanded that Budapest withdraw its controversial draft law aimed at limiting foreign funding of media organizations and NGOs. If the law were to come into force, it would give the government far-reaching powers to crack down on the press and critical voices in society. The EU Commission sees this as a serious violation of European principles and laws. The question is Prime Minister Viktor Orban going to be impressed by this strongly worded statement of the Commission? Jacob?
Well, the first thing to set right is that, and we've just published a series of reports on it at MCC Brussels, which people can look up, is that we're not talking here about civil society being under attack in any sense. We're talking about the fact that the EU funds to the tunes of tens, hundreds of millions of euros, organisations directly aimed at subverting Hungarian sovereignty, at subverting democracy in Hungary. There is a clear agenda by the European Union to push particular ideology on Hungary, and they've had a degree of success on that, but they do that through using citizens' taxpayer money from right across the European Union, right? So we're not talking about an attack on civil society. We're talking about an attempt to assert some measure of control over what is an ongoing attempt at regime change in Hungary by a large section of the European Union, right? So, and whether then the strongly worded statements or sanctions or the various measures that have been taken against the Orban and the Hungarian government are going to change things, I think thankfully not, because Viktor Orban, for all the faults that people might have with him, sticks up very strongly for Hungarian sovereignty, and that's to be applauded.
Okay, I think Kathleen has a different take on it.
Yeah, slightly. That's not the issue. I guess the European funds will be subject of these sort of investigations as well, but that's not the issue. The issue is that that via law you try to attack free speech and free ways of organizing yourselves the moment you start saying things that the government doesn't like. And that is anti-democratic. You see exactly the same thing happening in the United States with Trump. If people have an organization that advocates abortion, for instance, or LGBTQ rights, they can be under attack. And in a free democracy, you can be against or in favor, but you need to be able to express yourself. So it's a full attack. And it's not the first one. In 15 years, we've seen a full decline of all democratic principles in Hungary. And if that's what the Hungarian people want, then they have no part in the European Union. That's the essential part of it. The essential part is that we are a union of values. Equality is one of them. Democracy is another of them. And if you do not respect them, then you can sideline with the Russians, for instance.
Okay. This week, some members of the parliament have, from 5 different groups, have urged the Commission to immediately freeze all funds to Hungary. Is that, first of all, the right way to go? And second, is it legally possible?
When it comes to Hungary, I think that and subverting the democracy, as you claim, I think the main subversion of democracy has come from the top, from the government itself, over the last decade or so. We can't ignore that in the European Union. There are interests involved here as well. 18 billion, I think it is still on hold for Hungary, so already many sanctions have been taken. Keeping Hungary somehow on board, or at least hanging on to the deck, is important for solidarity within the European Union. it's not a black and white situation, but certainly there has to be some pushback.
Let's be very clear. Let's be very clear that the rule of law crusade against Hungary has nothing to do with what is actually going on in Hungary. It has nothing to do with democratic procedures in Hungary. It has nothing to do with the judiciary. It has to do everything with the fact that Viktor Orban and the Hungarian government take a different position on a variety of issues, such as the funding of LGBT organizations or the war in Ukraine. Right?
Russian sanctions.
That's what it has to do with. And we know this because, for example, in Poland right now, the EU's favoured candidate in Poland, the EU's top man in Poland, right, Donald Tusk, has embarked on a project which he explicitly talks about undermining the rule of law, making the rule up as he goes along. He calls it militant democracy, right? And at the moment, there is an enormous campaign against free institutions in Poland. But that gets a complete pass. You won't hear any strongly worded statements.
If Hungary goes against LGBTQ rights, that is not part of the value system.
No. What I'm saying is, well, it's more nuanced than that. You can have a government that doesn't like LGBTQ rights in Europe. I don't like that but you cannot explicitly try to eliminate organizations that advocate for that, and that's what they're doing. So they're eliminating free speech, rule of law. That's the essence. And if you do that, you don't have a part.
They're asking for
in the
greater
European Union.
transparency on organizations that receive foreign funding.
They can leave the European Union, right? You don't have to be part of it. You don't have to be part of the free, fair and democratic Europe. You can be part of another part of the world that has another political system. But you have to be clear on that.
What you're talking about doesn't happen.
You cannot just want the money from the European Union and the solidarity of all the members of the European Union and their citizens, and at the same time not share the common values. That is not possible.
But what you're talking about simply doesn't happen. What the law that you referenced in your introduction is about making sure that organisations that receive foreign funding properly declare it and don't engage in activities which are
We'll see what happens.
So it's an invention. So you've got an idea in your head that it's going to happen.
Are they targeting the media?
But as I said, the laws all relate to the amount of foreign funding received, right? And there's an ambition, as I've indicated, there's an ambition in the European Union to very carefully and systematically promote regime change in Hungary. And any country subject to such a wide media, financial, bureaucratic, legislative campaign against itself.
This is just not the case. There is no such agenda. There is the Lisbon Treaty, signed by all the member states, including Hungary. This lays down.
They brought in the
it's
leader
about
of the
the rule of law according to the Lisbon Treaty.
Right? Ursula von der Leyen's coronation, they brought in the leader of the main opposition party in Hungary. Sat him directly at the front. Exactly what I mean. They sat him directly in the front. Right, to send a clear signal that the European Union institutions are determined to make sure that Viktor Orban's government is no more.
Wonderful closing words. We have reached the end of Brussels, my love. Thank you to our panel, to all of you, and to our viewers at home. If you want to continue the conversation that we were having here on any topic, write to brusselsmylove@euronews.com or on social media. That's it for today. I'm Stefan Grobe. Take care and have an excellent week.